Okay, 1, 2, 3, here we are. So good afternoon. Welcome to the joint anthropology lecture series and Brazil Lab colloquium. I'm João Biel, professor of anthropology and director of the Brazil Lab at the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. It is wonderful to see so many of you here. A special welcome to colleagues from the Institute for Advanced Study and the larger Princeton community. We are grateful to the University Center for Human Values, the School of Public and International Affairs, the Program in Latin American Studies, the Human Rights Initiative, and the Department of Spanish and Portuguese for their partnership. We cannot thank enough Kimberly Biderman from Pearce and Patty Leib from Anthropology, who is now working with our Human Rights Initiative, for helping to organize this event and so much more. And we want to give a warm welcome, I don't know if she's in the room now, to Nicole Wagenblast, who has just started as our new Communications and Operations Manager. Hold that, please. She's in back there, yeah. It's timely and urgent that we gather to think together about the state of democracy. Across the globe, authoritarian movements are exploiting democratic institutions while howling them out from within. From the erosion of electoral integrity to the weaponization of misinformation and the capture of judicial systems, we are witnessing coordinating assaults on the democratic norms across the Americas, Europe, and beyond. Today's event brings together two leading thinkers who combine scholarly rigor with vital public outreach. Miguel Lago is a political scientist whose work sits at the vital intersections of health policy, technology, and democracy. He's currently a visiting lecturer in our Department of Anthropology, and earned his PhD from the Sorbonne in France. Miguel has taught at Sciences Po, Columbia, and Harvard. He's the co-author of three very important books: The Language of Destruction, What We Talk When We Talk About Populism, and Building a State for the 21st Century. His research spans populism, social media, and democratic innovation, a combination that allows him to see connections others might miss. Beyond the academy, Miguel serves as executive director of the Institute for Health Policy Studies, a leading Brazil-based research institute, and previously co-founded Nossas, in Spanish, nuestras, meaning our cities, Nossas Cidades, one of Latin America's largest civic tech organizations, which has mobilized millions around local social rights and democratic causes. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Economist, the Financial Times, and Le Monde. Named among the 100 most influential people in digital government by Apolitical in 2019, Miguel brings theoretical depth and the hard-won wisdom of someone who has built democratic infrastructures from the ground up. On top of this, he's a truly wonderful person. Jan Werner Miller is professor of politics at Princeton and one of the world's foremost scholars of democracy, populism, and European political thought. Trained at the Freie University in Berlin, University College London, Oxford, and Princeton, he has held fellowships at All Souls College London, the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, and the Institute for Advanced Study here in Princeton. He has taught as visiting professor at École des Hautes and Humboldt University, and last year he delivered lectures on the European Union and democracy at the Collège de France. His book, What is Populism?, has been translated into more than 25 languages and fundamentally shaped how scholars and citizens understand the populist challenge. His fear and freedom toward a different liberalism, Furcht und Freiheit, won the Bavarian Book Prize. Jan Werner's public commentary appears regularly in the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, Foreign Affairs, The Guardian, the New York Times, and Project Syndicate, reflecting his commitment to making democratic theory speak to democratic practice. Together, Miguel and Jan Werner offers a rare opportunity to think across the Americas and Europe, across theory and practice, across diagnosis and alternative concept work. Miguel's talk starts from a provocative premise. Contemporary authoritarianism is not simply democracy's antithesis, but one of the ways democracy itself is being reconfigured. He asks, what kinds of democratic reinvention remain possible when authoritarian dispositives coexist with and parasitize democratic forms? In terms of format, Miguel will begin with a 35-40-minute presentation, followed by Jan Werner's commentary. After their exchange that I will help to curate, we will open the floor for discussion. Please join us afterwards for a reception where we can continue this important conversation. So without further ado, let's give Miguel Lago our warmest welcome to Princeton.
Well, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you so much, Professor Buell, for the introduction, very generous introduction. And thank the whole Department of Anthropology for hosting me this semester. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. I'd also like to thank Miguel and Rodrigo for making this event possible, as well as all the partners that João has already mentioned. And I would like to thank, of course, Professor Müller for his very generous, for accepting to participate to this conversation. It's a true honor to be discussing with you. For someone who's passionate about politics, as I am, Professor Müller is not only a major reference, but also a major inspiration. So I'm a little bit nervous, so I'll stick to my notes. And but I would like to start with this image, because it's also the image of the invitation that we have for them. And this is a painting by Paul Klee that was painted in 1920, and it's called Angelus Novus. And the first owner of this painting is Walter Benjamin, the German philosopher, who tragically died in 1940, and who wrote and portrayed this painting as one of his theses around the concept of history, which I would like just to read you a few sentences. So the 9th thesis on history is, a clay painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he's about to move away from something he's fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned toward the past, where we perceive a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. And like the angel, we look to the past while being pushed towards an unknown future. And we try to make sense of the present that we have, but the present is really hard to read. And the best way to trying to read is, of course, naming it. And we're trying to name the new phenomena, the new political storms that we're living in the moment that we are inside those political storms and this new political phenomena. And some of the characteristics, the ways of naming it, authoritarianism or illiberal democracy or fascism or populism, so many others, they are anchored in previous experiences that we had. And all of them, to some extent, they capture something real about our present moment. We can see indeed fascist traits in gestures and actions of our today's leaders. We can see populist logics shaping political action, as very clearly shown in Professor Müller's remarkable book. We can see openly anti-liberal figures being elected through the popular vote. And we can see the spread of authoritarian tools across society far beyond the state itself. So the move from the past to the present makes sense, and these references help us see real continuities. But in my opinion, none of these terms on its own is enough to describe the whole and the totality of the movement that is happening. And for instance, take the word fascism. It's a heavy word. It carries a lot of history and strong moral weight. And it clearly signals dangers, which is good because we're living in dangerous times. But it can also close the debates very quickly, because something that was essential in classical fascism was the aim to create a new man. And we don't see this kind of project or aspiration in the nowadays movements, at least for the moment. So if we take, for instance, illiberal democracies, the liberal democracies has the opposite problem, is that it implies that democracy, well, is kept, it's just that is a little bit weaker because we have illiberal leaders taken into account. So we may underestimate how deep the change really is. So in both cases, the problem is not that these concepts are wrong, not at all. I think they inform us of something very important, but they're not enough to describe the whole situation. And I'm not equipped to name it, but I think that I can see, and this is what I want to bring here, a paradox that structures these political emergencies and that I would like to draw your attention. And this paradox is that we have more and more authoritarianism, at the same time we have less and less authority. So on the one hand, there is a clear expansion of authoritarian practices across liberal democracies. Exception measures become routine, surveillance intensifies, rights are incrementally constrained, and coercive state apparatus are deployed more frequently and more selectively. Elections continue to occur, legal frameworks remain, and constitutional language persists, yet democratic substance is hollowed out. Political conflict increasingly escape democratic mediation. Adversaries are framed as enemies. Disagreement becomes disrespect. So in extreme cases, segments of the population are excluded from the demos. On the other hand, we're seeing another process, which is the erosion of collective forms of authorities: science, religion, law, and many others. And this new sociability that is mainly and occurs mainly in social media is powering this erosion. Because there's only one kind of expression that is accepted in social media, and it is opinion. The only thing that exists in social media is opinion. No other form of knowledge is accepted there. And it's very easy because everybody is entitled to have an opinion, and no opinion is better than other opinion. But not every form of discourse is an opinion in itself. And the Greeks knew this very well. They had many categories of forms of knowledge. So you have the phronesis, you have the doxa, you have so many others, and they have a hierarchy for them, right? So of course the doxa exists, the opinion exists, but it's not what matters the most. And so if we look, a scientific paper is not an opinion. Theological exegesis is not an opinion. A medical orientation is not an opinion. And on social networks, they are all at the same level, as if they were simply equally comparable. I have a funny story just to tell you and to share with you, is that in 2018, I have two interesting stories from 2018 in Brazil. So 2018 is the year that Bolsonaro gets elected. And a famous Brazilian scientist posted on Facebook, on his Facebook page, in the time that existed Facebook. I don't know if you remember, for those who are young, probably they never met Facebook, but still. He published a Nature peer-reviewed article on climate change. And then there's a friend of his, like a classmate perhaps when he was a kid, that immediately answers, "I disagree." But of course, he didn't have time to read the article. He just read the title of the article. He didn't like it, and he posted, "I disagree." And it's very funny because you don't disagree with a scientific paper. You don't react like this to a scientific paper. You might want to contest a scientific paper, but you have methodology. You need to build a project, and so on and so forth. And you all know this better than I do. But on social media, the reaction is enough. And there's a second story that is even more worrying, and that tells a lot about Brazil. So the Pope, the Catholic Pope, has many Twitter accounts because he needs to speak in many languages to many people, since it's a universal church. And the Twitter account in Portuguese of Pope Francis published a tweet, very indirect, that could be interpreted as a criticism towards Bolsonaro. It was basically saying that violent political projects were not compatible to Christianity, something like that. And the most interesting thing happened. Thousands and thousands of Brazilians invade the Twitter page of Pope Francis, quoting the Bible in a specific passage, probably from the Old Testament, where violence is praised. So basically it was flooded with this kind of images. And it's very striking because Brazil is still is the largest Catholic country of the world. The Pope is the highest authority of the Catholic Church, which is still a medieval institution. She supposedly was named by God. And yet, people in Brazil, probably Catholics, many of them, they never study theology. They're not priests, they're not pastors, and yet they feel comfortable to quote the Bible to correct the Pope of the Catholic Church. So again, we're seeing a situation, or not even the authority of the Pope over Catholic theology is contested by social media. Everybody feels safe to say that. So that's what I mean by authority is disappearing, or at least it's eroding. And this is much stronger if we look at our institutions, and if we look how our institutions are perceived by a major part of the population. So when we think about the law, when we think about the courts, the justice, and the perception of the public is not any longer, in many countries, that those are shared references. Those are institutions that are in common. And this is also something that I'm a little bit worried with the term authoritarianism, because according to Hannah Arendt, even authoritarian regimes require the law. Of course, there are unjust laws, there are repressive laws, but they exist within a legal framework. You have the trials, of course, there are unjust trials, but you have trials, you have procedures, you have the law. And the question that I see here is an erosion of authorities, including the law, the idea of the law. So we have governments that are consistently violating the law and consistently trying to test all the limits of the law. So again, if we were to take Hannah Arendt's explanation and the differences between tyranny and authoritarian regimes, well, we couldn't qualify at least as a classical authoritarian regime in this sense towards its relation with the law. And but the weakening of legal and the weakening of authority produces a vacuum. And in the absence of stable authority and effective legal mediation, power ceases to operate primarily through legitimacy and normativity. And it reorganizes itself around force, acceleration, and asymmetry. Decisions are made more rapidly, enforcement becomes more selective, and outcomes increasingly depend on relative strength rather than a shared rules. So speed replaces deliberation, immediacy replaces procedure. What emerges is a society in which power circulates with fewer filters. It is a configuration in which force no longer appears as an exception to the rule, but as a normal mode of regulation, in which acceleration undermines contestation, and in which arbitrariness becomes an ordinary feature of political and social life. The paradox then is not that contemporary democracies are converging toward classical authoritarianism, but because we're not normalizing, what we're normalizing is not order, but vulnerability. We are letting people into a generalized exposure. But of course, there is resistance to this authoritarian dynamic, to say the least. And there have been successful cases, and I think one of the successful cases is Brazil. So Brazil constitutes a central case in the defense of democratic rule. And despite facing political leadership that openly challenged democratic norms, institutions, and basic principles of pluralism, the country managed to avert an institutional rupture. The most extreme authoritarian scenarios were contained. The constitutional order was preserved. So something really worked in Brazil, and I think that by comparative standards, it worked really relatively well, because today, Bolsonaro is in jail. When we examine the dominant pattern of response to this double movement, a clear logic emerges, is that the defense of democracy tends to be always in the sense of strengthening the law, empower the judiciary, protect constitutional institutions, reaffirm the centrality of political parties and of professional media. In other words, it's through consolidation of what Jan Werner Müller calls critical infrastructure of democracy. So, and these elements are indispensable for our democracy because they organize the political conflict in a democratic way. They establish the boundaries, the procedures, they structure political time, and they provide mechanisms for rights protection. And they saved Brazilian democracy. So I'm thankful to them. Now, the difficulty arises when this strategy is evaluated beyond the short term. While effective and in many cases necessary, this response is also deeply elitist in its structure and effects. It relies overwhelmingly on erudite authorities whose legitimacy, as we saw, is eroding. By concentrating democratic defense in these arenas, the response reinforces the core narrative advanced by authoritarian forces themselves, that democracy is governed by self-referential elites, that institutions operate above and against the people, and that the law functions primarily as a mechanism of this elite self-protection. So the feeling I have is the more we beat authoritarians, the more our shared authorities erode. So the paradox becomes a trap. And trying to name this trap, I call it Republican clericalism. And what I mean is that it's a mode of democratic preservation in which the survival of the regime is entrusted primarily to institutional elites. So it's democracy in this configuration is not protected through a broad social support, but through institutional insulation. So the problem is not that it failed, it's that it succeeded, and the costs of its success are high in the long term. So the parallel with the Catholic Church helps illuminate and understand a little bit of this cost, because historically, clericalism emerges as a strategy of institutional survival for the Catholic Church. Faced with fragmentation, heterodoxy, heresy, and external threat, the Church increasingly centralized authority, professionalized mediation, and reinforced hierarchical control. Clericalism protected the institution, guaranteed continuity, and prevented collapse in moments of profound crisis. Yet this strategy came at a high price. Over time, clericalism produced distance between the institution and the faithful. Religious life became bureaucratized. The sacred was no longer primarily animated, but managed. Authority shifted from vocation to function, from charisma to office. So this transformation did not destroy the church. It preserved it, but it altered its relationship with belief, attachment, and with the people. So Republican clericalism mirrors ecclesiastical clericalism in this precise sense. that it secures institutional survival, but by translating a living bond into a professionalized function. Mystery becomes ministry. So this is why I think democracy cannot be reduced to the regime of political parties, as Simone Weil pointed out, nor to the respect or to the strict respect to the rule of law, even though these elements are absolutely essential. But they remain means rather than ends, in my view. So the end of democracy, in my opinion, lies elsewhere. It's ultimately the purpose is the protection of forms of life, particularly those that are most exposed to domination, exclusion, and arbitrariness. So for me, democracy is a political project oriented toward creating conditions under which diverse lives can exist, act, develop, and be shielded from unchecked exercise of power. In a recent book, Pierre Rosanvallon argues that the formal institutions that exist in democracy, to work properly, they require what he calls invisible institutions. And he names 3 invisible institutions, which are trust, legitimacy, and authority. So the central challenge, therefore, is, of course, not to abandon institutional defense, but to situate it within a broader horizon of meaning. So my message here is that we need to reanimate institutions through mystery, and that's my invitation for you all. And I'm explaining a little bit what I think about that. So I believe we need to rescue, and I know how I'm in the time. I'm okay? Okay. Okay. But I think it's important for us to reconnect the procedural existence of our institutions with their ethical vocation. And we need to revive those institutions in this sense. And I think that institutional innovation, that is something that we're not discussing any longer, because the only thing that we're doing for the past 10 years is containing authoritarianism, is extremely important. It's perhaps one of the best defense mechanisms that we have as well. And when I say institutional innovation, I don't believe that only with institutional innovation we will save democracy, because its impact, of course, is limited. But there are some devices that can be used. Some are more promising, others are more fragile. But the fact is that there's no such thing as doing a total redesign of democracy. There's no tabula rasa possible for democracy. So the idea is to really do constantly institutional innovations and multiplying them. So basically, the idea that we can reinvent democracy from top down is super technocratic, in fact, because it's the idea that you can simply position yourself as a master over democratic life, as if institutions could be redesigned from above, detached from history, conflict, and social ties. So essentially, what I think it should be done is basically the multiplication of experiences and the creation of what can be described as democratic enclaves. These enclaves do not resolve the structural contradictions of democracy, but they generate democratic density. They produce habits of participation, and they contribute to the constitution of a shared democratic grammar through repetition and use. Across different countries, a wide range of experiments in democratic innovation has been implemented, taking diverse institutional forms and responding to distinct political contexts. None of these initiatives taken individually can be expected to save democracy. Their significance lies elsewhere. It resides in their multiplication and in the decentralization of decision-making processes they enable. So think of participatory budgeting, citizens' assemblies, local referenda, deliberative forums, and numerous practices that we have already adopted, but that we could also invent new institutions in this sense. So, and I mean, the first participatory budgeting was in Porto Alegre 40 years ago, basically. So it's older than me. And of course, it has a limited impact. But if you have participatory budgeting, if you have citizens' assembly, if you have this multiplication, and if decision-making is more decentralized, then we create this habit of participation in the day-to-day of people. And because this is probably what will be my core message when we're talking about democracy, is that it's not only to have a democratic state, is also to requires a democratic society. And democratic life weakens when participation is reduced to moments of authorization and delegation. And it is strengthened when decision-making is embedded in social life, when decision-making simply becomes a regular thing that we all as citizens participate to. So democracy requires spaces in which individuals and groups encounter one another, not as abstract categories, not as voters, but as participants that share problems, conflicts, and responsibilities. The democratization of society presupposes a condition that is often overlooked: the existence of civic infrastructure. Because democratic participation does not arise spontaneously. It requires material, organizational, and symbolic capacities that allow collective action to emerge and endure. This infrastructure includes the capacity to communicate, to organize collectively, and to sustain movements over time. Without such capacities, democratic practices tend to become episodic and fragile. And what I mean here is certainly not the outrage networks that social media has empowered. Actually, they are the opposite of what I'm talking about. Posting your outrage online does not create infrastructure, does not build capacity, does not organize people. The only thing that you do when you post your outrage is that you're feeding your data to these private-owned platforms that are not very democratic. So when I talk about civic infrastructure, I mean something else. I mean the capacity of individuals and groups to act together, to coordinate, to sustain action over time. And this is action, is not opinion. It's the opposite of opinion. We don't care about the opinion of one another, we're doing something together. It's praxis, it's not doxa. So this is the way through solidarity networks, associative life, community organizing, things that exist beyond posting and that can survive the moments when the outrage is gone. So democratic reconstruction ultimately depends on the constitution of the commons. Fragmentation thrives where experiences are segregated, where policies differentiate rigidly between groups, and where social life is organized through parallel worlds that rarely intersect. I know that economists in the room won't be happy with what I'm saying here, but I believe that universalism and universal public policies have this role to have people and to fight this kind of social fragmentation. Because when we think that the public policies are only for the poor or only to specific groups, we also lose the opportunity of making people meet and people live under the same rules. This doesn't mean that we don't need to tackle specific needs or specific groups. That's not what I mean. But what I mean is that we need to come back also to look at universal health systems and universal public services in a way that is not only extremely pragmatical and trying only to solve an inequality problem. We need also to think the public service as a way of gathering people together, of creating citizenship together. So this is essentially what I was talking. I talked about commons, about universal public services, about civic infrastructure, institutional innovation, decentralized decision-making, social movements. And all of this is absolutely necessary if we want to bring mystery back into the ministry. But maybe something is still missing from what I've designed here, and something that is much harder to accept, especially for us social scientists. And this is the question of grand narratives. The big stories, the shared horizons, creating meaning. And we're trained to be suspicious of them, and we're rightly so, because we were trained to deconstruct them. But without them, some kind of shared narrative, it's harder to achieve this common ground. So this is a question more for all of us, because I know that grand narratives are partial, are misleading, and never fully aligned with empirical reality. However, they sustain horizons of expectations, to quote Reinhard Kozlek, and make the idea of a common destiny intelligible. So they may be nationalists, religious, humanist, or internationalists. Each carries its own risks and exclusions. Populism and religion are frequently approached as threats to democratic life. And in many contexts, this diagnosis is justified. Both can be mobilized to exclude and to suppress plurality. But both populism and religion function as languages of mobilization, belonging, and meaning. They articulate grievances, structure identities, and generate collective energy. In certain contexts, they could eventually mobilize not to close democratic space, but to reopen it, to reconnect politics with lived experience, and to reinsert excluded actors into collective life. So my final question to you is this: what limits should we keep in mind as we try to revive democratic institutions and rebuild a democratic society? Can we solve the paradox, authoritarianism, authority, that I have presented without creating a new paradox? So that's it. Thank you.
So now for the Republican clerical response. I had the privilege of seeing Miguel's lecture beforehand, and by now you know that it's a very rich text full of astute observations that many of you will want to discuss later on. It's also a text that resists the temptation of playing off defense of existing institutions against something more radical in the strict sense of radical, as in going to the roots, going back to basics. That has often been a very, very unproductive discussion in recent years. And Miguel, to his credit, resists that particular temptation. So I'm going to offer 4 very brief comments slash questions. First of all, you talked about erosion of law and a sense of generalized exposure. First of all, at the risk of seeming very pedantic and nitpicking, I'm not sure we should be using the term erosion. The Jersey Shore is eroding. It's a quasi-natural phenomenon. But the rule of law is not eroding. There's nothing natural about it. It is a very conscious project that is pursued, as we all know, by actors who usually have a plan or a project of one sort or another. Now, one, I think, very helpful way of understanding what is happening right now, and I'm not the first person to say this in recent weeks, actually is a theory that comes to us out of the 1930s. And that is the theory by the German lawyer Ernst Fraenkel about the so-called dual state. He was already saying in the late 30s, look, there are plenty of areas in German society under the Nazis where things seem perfectly normal and where you would never say, oh, the rule of law is eroding or it's completely gone. But at the same time, he also said that what he called the prerogative state can become active at any point and then basically act with impunity. And that, when you think about recent weeks, might remind you of 1 or 2 things. He also said that the line between the prerogative state and the normal rule of law is always uncertain. So in that sense, yes, generalized exposure, because we don't know who's going to be hit. At the same time, it doesn't feel like generalized exposure because there's still so many areas where everything seems perfectly normal, just like right now and right here. Could have had the same event, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, would have felt exactly the same. So I think that's a very helpful framing of the issues, but of course it increases the challenge in terms of how does one create a sense that no, it's not normality, and at the end of the day, it is generalized exposure. Secondly, I was very intrigued, I'm sure others were too, by your call for more mystery. Except that I found the term mystery slightly mysterious. In fact, even worse, I found it slightly dangerous. When I think about mystery in politics, or people telling us that we should re-enchant politics, names that come to mind for me are usually the ones of early 19th century French counter-revolutionary or counter-enlightenment thinkers. It's someone like Joseph de Maistre who says, yeah, you need mystery in order to establish authority. Now, the point is not a sort of, simplistic vindication of transparency. I think that's a very complicated story of how transparency and democracy really hang together. I'm just really asking, what did you mean exactly? And is it just shorthand for just something more emotional or passionate, because that's sort of what it sounded like towards the end? But again, I may have misunderstood, so I'd be grateful for any clarification. Thirdly, you also talked about, especially in the paper, about the need to go beyond a democratic state and to create a democratic society. And there as well, I was wondering whether that point could be clarified a little bit more. Does democratic society mean what someone like Tocqueville meant when he talked about the United States as a democratic society? So not a story about institutions, but a story about basically a sense of social equality. People can look each other in the eye. There's no sense of feudalism, no sense that, we stand with each other in the kind of hierarchical relationship. Is it, quote unquote, just that? I mean, of course, it means a lot. It's not a trivial thing at all. But that's very different from, for instance, going a step further and saying, no, it really means a very vibrant civil society. You still very often hear that argument nowadays because, we are also in an age where people are constantly recycling certain arguments from the 20th century about a crisis of loneliness. So we've gone from bowling alone, which we already knew in 2000, to posting alone. And all of that supposedly is creating pernicious forms of politics. And what I would, again, in a very pedantic, nitpicking way, maybe suggest is that, yes, civil society is important, but civil society is not automatically democratic. Our former colleague Sherry Berman already showed us in the 90s that contrary to what some 20th century observers had claimed, Weimar Germany had a vibrant civil society, but it was full of people who were anti-democrats. Or maybe less obviously, there's a great article by the sociologist Dylan Riley who said, look, if you compare northern Italy and Spain in the 20s, it's very interesting that they were very similar political projects. But fascism on a certain level succeeds because, as everybody remembers, also from Robert Putnam, northern Italy has a very well-developed civil society. So lots of organizations can basically move into fascism, and that really creates a different kind of hegemony than Franco, who of course also succeeds in creating something very authoritarian, but it's not quite the same as what Mussolini is able to do in terms of sheer penetration of society. So what does democratic society in that sense mean? And does it maybe also mean that actually all institutions in a democratic society have to be subject to regular democratic standards, which most tenured professors are not happy with as an idea. But again, it's more a question. Finally, enclaves, democratic enclaves. I'm fully on board with what you're suggesting, but again, just for the sake of being slightly contrarian, if I may, I think one of the things we've learned the hard way in recent years is that in a weird way, some of these enclaves can also develop a very peculiar elitist dynamic. I'll just give one example. So nobody is officially against citizen assemblies. Nobody is against the idea that we should randomly select what is, patronizingly called ordinary citizens, ordinary people. They talk to each other, they maybe make recommendations. Everybody says, in principle, that's a good idea. And undoubtedly, it's likely to have at least some beneficial effects. People can look at these institutions and say, oh, no, there's somebody who's just like me. So finally, I feel there is somebody there, as opposed to parliaments where, as you all know, across the West, workers have basically disappeared as deputies. Doesn't exist anymore. So all that's to the good. But the institution itself might have a particular dynamic that actually doesn't so clearly point towards something democratic. Here's the specific example. Some of you may remember that Macron had a citizen assembly on climate. And the thing that people usually worry about, which is, okay, it's going to be totally dominated by old, well-educated males, that did not happen. It was actually very participatory. Lots of people spoke. It was really well curated as well. And Macron had also said, look, the thing that usually happens with these assemblies, which is that people issue recommendations and then everybody ignores them, is not supposed to happen. I promise you, I'm going to implement some of these things, but I'm also going to reserve what you call jokers. So I'm going to strike down some of your proposals, but you have a fair amount of control over what I ultimately will or will not implement. And the curious thing that happened is that these randomly chosen citizens themselves, after a while, said, look, now we've listened to all the experts, and we have the option of going around Macron and putting it to a referendum directly. But we're not going to do that because we've listened to the experts and we've been educated about these issues. But our fellow French citizens have not been. So it's too dangerous to leave it to the people. So we trust Macron. You can guess how the story ends. Macron plays his joker. He strikes down this particular proposal. Later on, there was at least some evidence that actually, had they put it to the people, it would have gone through in a referendum. Now, that's just one example. That's not a general argument against citizen assemblies. And you've rightly also said, look, let's not oversell these things. None of this is a panacea for our problems. But it's just, I think, just worth reminding ourselves that, quite apart from the fact that these are small institutions, they might also sometimes develop a dynamic that, is not so easily what one was initially looking for. But again, thank you for the text, thank you for the lecture. I look forward to maybe a conversation.
We'll now hear an initial response from Miguel, and then maybe a little back and forth, and then we'll open up to questions from you all, okay?
Well, thank you for this amazing questions and amazing reflections. And well, first of all, starting from the end. So when I was saying that we should do democratic innovation, I was mentioning republics. I was not referencing to monarchies, and I understand that Macron is a king, so that's why also it didn't happen well, the citizen assembly. But I think that we have very good examples, and you're right. So that in the French examples that we had, the citizens' assemblies were very dependent on the experts that came. But I think there are other situations, especially when we look at Ireland, and when we see that citizens' assemblies, and when they are connected and linked to referendums, they can have interesting outcomes in terms of deliberation. So again, I think this is one of the many possibilities that we can create. But of course, the power dynamics exist and will exist in all these enclaves where there is relations, interpersonal relations, there is power, and there are always dynamics of power. So I agree with you. This enclaves will not be a panacea, but I think that they could help us move further. And I agree with you that the social movements and the civil society not necessarily is always democratic. We can have social movements that are far-right social movements. Fidesz in Hungary built an amazing social movement before getting to power in the last, in the beginning of this century. Very capillarized, etc. And of course, it was a social movement that was certainly anti-democratic. So I agree with you that not necessarily civil society is always democratic, and it can, of course, help and promote the authoritarian rule or anti-democratic practices. But I also think it's absolutely important that the democratic ones thrive, and that they had the ability of communicating and organizing. And I fear that we're more and more dependent on communication structures that are privately owned and that really transform the work of these social movements in an impossible work, because it's really hard to mobilize people when like mobilizing in Facebook in 2011 is completely different from nowadays, because there was some possibility of doing so. Nowadays it's impossible. It's only about posting some kind of narrative, and that's it. You cannot connect people actually to go into some action. You cannot organize people through social media. So when I was referencing to this, that we need to have civic infrastructure that is built and that lives outside of this. But I was also referencing to what Tocqueville and this idea of social equality, of societies that are not completely egalitarian, but that has much more equality than our societies have, because I think that with the levels of inequalities that we have in our country, especially when I look at mine, it's really hard to have a democratic society. So that's the sense when I was talking about the universal public services, that I think that they help us to at least force the relations between poorer people and richer people. If they're all in public school, if they all go to public hospitals. I know it's a very conservative idea that I have, but I think it's something that could be beneficial in terms of this social equality, because everybody should respond to the same rules, to the same authorities. So it's a public doctor, it's a public teacher, and so on and so forth. And I'm not meaning socialism, I'm meaning social equality in this sense. And mystery, I agree with you. And of course, de Maistre is, well, it's a fascinating author, but of course with very reactionary elements. But I was, the way that I used mystery was more, let's say, was more because of the comparison with the Catholic Church. So since I was talking about clericalism, so it was in this sense. So mystery was more symbolic. I was not, but I do think that we need to revive our institutions and make them more vibrant. And I think that this means reconnecting them to some extent to this purpose of the situation. So that's by what I meant mystery. It's reconnecting the people to the institutions in a way, and I know that's it's very abstract and probably not absolutely precise what I'm saying, in a way that we continue and keep trusting our institutions. So I think it's a little bit in the idea of Rosan Vallon, of the invisible institutions, that I would anchor this argument about the mystery. I think we need to recover legitimacy, authority, not authoritarianism, and trust. Because if we don't trust our institutions, it's not possible to have them re-enchanted. So that's what I'm saying about the re-enchantment. And for this, of course, it's not necessarily a problem of the institutions, but I do believe that the institutions have become so professionalized, so elitist, as you mentioned. There are no workers any longer represented in Congress as you used to have. That I think that we should reflect a little bit more about how we can rebuild this trust. And I was fascinated by the prerogative state and the normal rule of law, because I didn't know this comment. But one question that I had, if I can,
yes, please,
is that I did a provocation in the end of my presentation that you didn't took on. So I'm going to ask you, can populism be a democratic force? You don't see any possibility? Never.
Your turn.
Exactly what I was trying to avoid. Let's not get into a semantic debate. You and I mean different things. Yes. I understand that in Latin America, the word populism has a different history.
That's true.
Of course, it suggests something inclusive. If people on the street tell me Lula is a populist, I would not say, oh, no, you're wrong. You totally misunderstand. Of course, but I don't think it's, we talk about different things, basically. Okay. The only thing I would say, if you have 1 second, is that, with all due respect for Rosan Vallon, I find this idea that trust is an institution completely implausible. It's not, trust means that you don't know something, okay? Otherwise, no need to trust. Otherwise, you have certainty. And the most plausible account is precisely to say, okay, I know enough about an institution that has competence and goodwill. Mm-hmm. And that also can apply at an interpersonal level. But that's not an institution. That's what you know about an institution. But the trust itself is not an institution.
Anyway, just
Yeah,
for
okay.
maybe
We can
to
keep this
be continued.
discussion.
Can I just jump in before opening up? And I think just building on Jan Werner's comments, and I think getting back to something that you said at the very beginning, that fascism, for example, had the project of a new man, a new anthropos. Maybe I heard it wrong, but in Jan Werner's contrarian view, he was also thinking of a certain anthropos today, a certain figure of the human or of the social today. And I just wonder if that concept that you use in other writings and your thinking of authoritarian enclaves does not help to understand the paradoxes, but also the limits of imagining this democratization of society.
Wow.
So maybe we are, just as we are altered chemical beings, maybe we are altered political subjects now, but altered in a way, as you said, looking back, informed by the authoritarianism that has been part already and parcel of our existence and of institutions.
Yeah. No, that's a fantastic reflection. Yeah, I think to some extent that there's something that we didn't mention, but I think that to some extent the sociability being mainly on social media, this creates to some extent, I wouldn't say a new political subject, of course, but this certainly distorts the idea of the individual as a political subject, because you behave as a profile when you are on social media. You don't behave as an individual. You have very clear incentives. You have very limited scope of actions. It's to some extent is the perfect homo economicus is in the profile, because you have clear incentives and clear outcomes. And so I think that this, I guess that this influences the way that we perceive the dangers and the things that happen in actual world. Because since everything is so virtual and everything is equally, nothing really matters. So to some, I don't know if this doesn't alter our capacity to be ashamed of what is happening. And I think that shame is something that is very human. It's also a very conservative argument that I'm using, but that we're living a shameless period where our leaders do not have shame any longer, so they're never ashamed of what's happening or what they're doing, right?
Let's open now and let's continue the conversation. So we have Stephen, Pedro, and you, right?
Of course.
So we'll collect bundles of questions, so that then Miguel and then Jan Werner, if he wants to participate in the discussion.
So you said at the end that we have a problem of authority and trust in institutions because they're so professionalized and elitist. But earlier on, you said that we should return, it seemed, to the idea of a distinction between opinion and knowledge, and social media is merely opinion. It's not peer-reviewed. So, I mean, it seems like the biggest division, certainly in American society, is a diploma divide between people with high levels of education who favor peer review and ordinary people with less education. That's the divide. And you seem to be straddling it in these different comments. On the one hand, talking about the excessive professionalization and elitism of institutions. On the other hand, condemning ordinary people's opinions as expressed on social media. And admittedly, social media does have algorithmic enhancement of outrage and so on. But nevertheless, it's open to ordinary people. So doesn't there need to be, one of the things that I wonder if you need to register more is greater respect for real grievances, perhaps on the other side of the political spectrum even, in order to build the common ground that you say you want to ground. You haven't really challenged any sort of progressive orthodoxies, let me put it that way, except maybe with your observation at the end about institutions being dominated by professionals and elites, but that came at the very end. So how do you build common ground unless we're more willing to take the other side seriously, including views expressed on social media, which may not be expressed very well, but I think they do have a mobilizing effect, and there are real grievances that lead people to favor candidates that we despise quite properly. But we shouldn't underestimate the anger and the resentment of less educated people who have not done well under globalization and who in some ways reflect, again, there are reasonable disagreements about many policies on which there tends to be a kind of progressive educated orthodoxy.
Miguel's next, Pedro, and then.
Thank you, Miguel. It's always so good to hear you. I have a question. I think I understand the whole idea. I mean, how to animate, which is not any word, right? How to animate procedures, combat democratic clericalism or elitism through democratic enclaves, so through a sort of civic infrastructure. But the anarchist that lives inside me, with whom I try to repress often, asks if at the very moment you use the word, you name it, civic infrastructure, you are not already sort of destroying or eroding, I don't know, what would be sort of, coming from inside, from the roots. And in this regard, how to avoid infrastructure to become elitist itself, a little bit of theory of elites is certainly good here. I think that Jean-Werner pointed to that. But I wonder, going back to mystery, this re-enchantment that you are using in order to avoid the Maistre-like kind of re-enchantment, are we talking about specifically, not staying in the heights of theology, but in the here and now of history, are we talking about charisma and leadership? Can we talk about this without those terms? And you know how much I can't kind of escape Lago when I think about this, but can you clarify the semantics here? And I would ask you what you asked Jean-Werner. What can populism be a democratic force? And then what are you thinking about populism exactly? Thank you.
And your name? Muriel.
Thank you so much for the talk. This was fascinating and very reinvigorating. But one thing that I was wondering, and this is a little bit motivated by the metaphor that you use, using Catholicism as kind of a starting point to think about this, is like democratic forces in Brazil, and I think in a lot of countries that are experiencing similar processes of, to use our term, erosion, they have lost their social base. And kind of what you're talking about is kind of rebuilding that social base that is kind of territorialized, that is located in a place of sociability, that then can build this abstracted idea of democracy through these kind of more local interactions, which is very different from the logic of social media, as you talked about. Fascism, on the other hand, at least the way that it has taken form in Brazil, has a strong social base, evangelical churches. And it's not that evangelicalism has anything inherent to it that makes it reactionary, but the way that forces have been configured within the church right now in Brazil and a lot of the world have kind of produced the social base for this type of movement. At the same time, you have this kind of institutional, I'm going to say left, but it's really like these center to center left democratic forces that do exist in Brazil that are formed by a very secular elite that has a really hard time interfacing with these expressions that are still extremely widespread, especially among the parts of Brazil that haven't been fully incorporated into this broader democratic project. So I was wondering, how do you, there's a divide between basically the people who care about democracy and a lot of religiosity in Brazil and a lot of the world. At the same time, people are getting a lot of their sociability through those means, which that's the only place you go to every week, right? How do you, how do you see the role of religiosity in this kind of reanimation of democracy? And two, how do you bridge that gap?
Okay, 3 minutes, and then we'll open up for the next round.
Okay. So, well, thank you for all your questions. And trying to a little bit, if I was elitist in my argument, that's not what I wanted to say, in the sense that I recognize the grievances and they think they're super legitimate, and that's the first thing. The second thing, I'm not against that people will outrage their grievances publicly. It's not that the problem. The problem is the result in terms of sociability that this creates. It's the idea that living in social media, where you can only, and where algorithms are asking and forcing you to give your opinion about absolutely anything, I think this creates some kind, it's not that, the problem is not that people are expressing their opinions. I'm not against expressing opinions. I'm against the fact that we can only express opinions and that everything is turned into opinion. That's it. I don't think we need scientific papers leading the world. I don't think that experts or technocrats should lead the world. That's not what I was mentioning. So this is the way that I believe. I don't think I agree with you that that normally this divide, we should try to regroup people. But I don't think that you regroup people necessarily speaking only about their demands or their needs. I don't think it's creating a mediation between two poles that you can create a common ground. I think the common ground, it's outside of those poles. And that's, going to your question, what I think that populism might do, and I agree that we are not necessarily speaking about the same term, and the historical function of populism in Latin America, when we think about Vargas in Brazil or Perón in Argentina, and then the most recent populists like Evo Morales and Rafael Correa, is that you create a new common ground. You're creating a new political identities where different identities can meet. And I think this is a little bit what Lago also references when he talks about the importance of empty signifiers in politics. So, because it's this capacity that populism might have, it doesn't mean that it always have, but it might have, and in previous experience it had, at least in Brazil and some countries in Latin America, of creating new identities that gather people who initially, and who do have differences and have different identities. So in some kind of way, it creates new equivalences and new possible alliances. So in this sense, populism could be democratic, but I agree that many, many times populism, and often, is used in an anti-democratic way. If you think about Chavez, for instance, in Venezuela, and in the history of Latin America, we have several figures that use populism as a way of preparing for dictatorship, including Vargas. Vargas is a more controversial and interesting character, but there are many Vargas, not only one Vargas. So, and going to the question about the divide between the secular elite that protects democracy and the role of religion, and I think that Jan Bernard Müller has more interesting ideas than I do because of all your work with Christian democracy and all your reflections around this. But I think that Europe did that in the past. The Christian Democrats, when they existed, and I don't know if they still exist, but when they existed, no. When there is, I think it's an interesting bridge between Christianity and welfare state and secular institutions. At the same time, we have also experiences in Latin America that of connections either between political movements and popular Catholicism, that it's not the same thing as Roman Catholicism. So the popular Catholicism is basically the way that the religion existed for a long time in Latin America, because we never had priests in Latin America, have very few priests, so the people were basically themselves educated and evangelizing. And of course, Rome always fought the churches in Latin America. That's our history as the periphery of the Catholic Church. But also in the liberation theology, and Raimundo is here, and that I think it's also an important experience in Brazil specifically because all our important social movements from the 80s and 90s come from the not the church in itself, but from liberation theology. So, and Lula is a result of that. So, and I think Lula, even though he's very secular in the way he speaks, I think he's secular for us. If you look at what Lula says in the Northeast, it's very, very popular Catholicism. So, I think Lula, as a good populist, is always changing his discourse depending on the audience. So, I think there are, but I agree with you. This divide needs to be. We need to bridge a way where we can conciliate religion and democracy in this sense.
Yeah. Okay, I'll try to be very brief. I'm fascinated and inspired by your idea of democratic enclaves, but I have two questions. First of all, who would build them? Because we are sharing this skepticism about elites. And secondly, which democratic enclaves should we prioritize? You've mentioned referenda as a possibility, as a democratic enclave. But of course, Correa and several of the other populists that you mentioned used referenda to their advantage. Mm-hmm. So tell me more about exactly what they'd look like and mostly who would build them.
Great, awesome. So we'll collect the second round and then a third round. And then we'll continue the conversation and we will do another event with Miguel. Okay, Fadi and then Orla and Richard, yes.
Thanks, Miguel. That was wonderfully distilled and very thought-provoking. It seems to me that your notion of democratic politics rests on the citizen as the political subject. And one of basically the main features of our day globally is that the citizen is not only a category of inclusion, but of exclusion as well. Immigrants, refugees, sans-papiers, discourse against foreigners in Japan, in the US, of course. So it's not only the adversary who's the new enemy, but it's something that Balibar has been thinking about for a long time now. It's the stranger who is the new enemy. And I wonder how your re-enchantment of politics that you're sort of putting on the table can speak to that. Because it seems to me that you're speaking to liberals. And I get the impulse and I share it with you. But I think that's a crucial question to think about the sort of whether the subject of democratic politics is the citizen. And I think these two are not necessarily synonymous today. The second question about grand narratives. You know, there are some concepts that you've used, like fascism, that may not be conceptually articulate in describing the present, but could be actually ideologically powerful as a mezzo-level grand narrative. You know, like an anti-fascist struggle. Mm-hmm. So I wonder whether you're sort of thinking about these concepts only in terms of naming the present or as ideological concepts that actually could have a power to mobilize without going to what scares a lot of people in the room, religion, populism, etc., with liberal sensibilities. Thank you.
Thank you. Really enjoyed your talk, Miguel, and I love the ideas. And one of the problems with being an optimist is that your audience become a bunch of naysayers. But I do want to ask the political economy question, which is, it just strikes me that you can build all the innovative democratic models you want, but in a context where 12 of the richest men in the world have more wealth than 50% of the world, over 4 billion people, and where in the United States, the bottom 50% have 2% of the wealth of the country. It strikes me you can do all the technocratic model building you like, but in that context, things are going to fall apart. And populists, like Stephen was saying a moment ago, are going to build a politics of resentment around those grievances, which is going to be very powerful and is going to be a countervailing force. Now, until 1975, there was an organized working class that could put a check on inequality. And that's why that period of 1945 to 1975 was one of state corporatism and the national healthcare system and the building of cooperative societies around the world, not just in Europe. That organized working class has been decimated, has been shipped to countries that can control it through, authoritarian, autocratic means, as in China. So I'm just wondering where the underlying fundamentals of the political economy feature in your system, and how that might be addressed in the absence of historically the kind of labor movements that could put a check on inequality.
Awesome. Orla?
Well, thank you so much. This is also, just to echo everybody, super fascinating. I had a question kind of about I guess I wanted to ask what you take of this, to return to the question of enchantment and ministry versus mystery. I was wondering if you, I guess I hear echoes of Weber, right, in this question about enchantment and the commensurability between what you're saying for ministry and democracy, whether what you're actually arguing is maybe kind of Durkheimian, in the sense of the crisis of democracy is often framed as a crisis of belief. And Durkheim, famously wrote about belief, and belief being kind of, you don't believe and then go to church, you believe because you go to church. And so I'm wondering kind of where that sits with you and what you think about that in relationship to your conversation about mystery.
That's great. So Miguel, this amazing 4 commentaries, questions. Now you have only 2 minutes to respond to them because we want to have the 3rd round. It's a game here. Game on.
So to the question of all fascinating questions. To start with the idea of the stranger, and I think this is a very provocative idea, and yes, and all the things that I'm praising for, like grand narratives and even democratic enclaves, could eventually turn against and exclude the stranger, and but I think that perhaps what we're thinking, and going to Richard's question about the fact that we have the labor class is completely dismantled, in fact, in Western countries. But we are seeing new social groups, very precarized workers that are often strangers, and that are not yet organized, or not sufficiently organized as the labor class used to be. So I think that there's perhaps something there, but it will need organizing. And again, to organize, you need to have the capacity either to meet or either to communicate at distance. And we don't have any of the two, because those precarized workers do not have the time to meet, and probably it's not that easy to meet. And the second problem is that to communicate, we depend on platforms that are, again, they're not public infrastructures. So to some extent, it's difficult to see the possibilities and the conditions for these groups to organize themselves. But I believe that I agree with you with the level of inequality that we have in many Western countries, especially in the Americas, in our both countries. I think it's yeah, exactly. You can do all the political innovation. It will be hard to get a democratic society. But that, going to your point, Orla, is that I believe that that's why I don't have one. I don't give one solution or one way. I think there are many ways, and they need to be displayed together, because otherwise, if we need to have groups organizing, we need to have social movements, we need to have democratic innovation as well, things happening at the same time. Because that's what I think it's very important that we haven't tested yet, is the decentralization of decision-making, is doing that decision-making is something so sacred in democracy, institutions is so sacred and banalize decision making. Not all decision makings, of course. There are some decision makings where you need the technocrats, but plenty of decision makings that we do could be different. For instance, I don't know, city. In my country, here is a little bit different, but in my country, like the way that cities are governed, they're governed as it was a state. There's a parliament, there's like the head of the executive branch. That makes no sense. Like, it's a city. So many other possibilities that we could be doing. So I think this practice of the day-to-day decision making, I think it's important to try to decentralize decision making in order to create this belief in democracy. And finally, going to the referenda, I agree with you. Referenda can be, it's not, again, it's not necessarily positive or negative. It can be, Pinochet did his constitution through a referenda. Of course, it was a referenda. It was a little bit weird of the rules that he used, but still, he used the referenda. And you have many dictators that use referenda to validate. So I don't think that referenda in itself, it's a democratic enclave in itself. But because normally referendums is always about something really big. And I think what will be much more interesting is to have referendas that are about local decisions, for instance. This kind of referendums, I think it will be much more interesting and could be much more democratic, because you're not necessarily deciding upon someone's rights or some constitutional change. It can be simply where should we prioritize our investment in your neighborhood, for instance. So simple things like that. So I think that the practice of referenda is very interesting, but it can be used for terrible results.
We don't want to end here on terrible results, right? So I just wonder if we can keep you for 5 more minutes, and then we go to, because we would like to collect a final round, and then have some final words from Miguel. And I would actually already plant a question. It would be great also to hear from Jan Werner, like which questions you would like to leave us with, given what you're hearing here. What are some of the things that we should be thinking about? We have work to do. We have thoughtful work to do, concept work to do. Okay. So we have Echo here, right?
I thought there's no me, but
yeah, there is no.
Jumping into it, I mean, this is really good and really bold and really imaginative, and we can be more imaginative here. I mean, re-enchantment is happening only in dissatisfying forms, right? And to me, it's interesting that re-enchantment is happening in plurality, that it seems like there's re-enchantment in enclaves already there. It's like everyone, you mentioned infrastructure, it's like everyone is sort of building roads, but not of the same width, and so that you cannot run cars in between. And instead of populism and grand narratives, I am imagining what does it look like if there's possibility to allow for commute between these re-enchantment enclaves. And maybe that's another form of prefigurative politics. And what would that look like? Or even knowing that many of the enclaves are outrightly right-wing and conservative.
Okay, great. In the back, your name? Ivan? Okay.
Thank you for the great discussion. I was wondering about 2 points or 2 tensions that your argument seems to elicit. The first one is, I was wondering how to make compatible this definition of democracy as a project in which diversity can exist unchecked from arbitrary power, and which seems to be a quite counter-majoritarian liberal definition of democracy, and the majoritarian solutions that you are proposing that have a lot to do with promoting and reinforcing civil society. So I don't know if there is some tension there between these 2 aspects of the argument. And the second one, which I think is maybe more interesting in practical terms, is so some of the citizens' assemblies the experience have been very positive. But I think there is still some tension that I would like to ask you about, as is how to make compatible some of these participatory experiences with accountability. So how to bridge the gap between who is in charge of decision making and who bears the consequences of the decision making afterwards. I think I don't know if there is any experience that may illuminate this question.
Great. Now you have 1 minute for this final question. Then we cannot get all the questions, but we want you to talk to Miguel. Oh, Hazal, have you? Okay, Hazal. Okay, good. So comparative. So we have. Okay, perfect. Okay, one more. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I have a question about your discussion on law and lawlessness, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, because I mean, looking closely at how law operates, complicates our understanding of authoritarianism as it is, and I agree with this claim more in terms of the relationship between democracy and authoritarianism, and authoritarian tendencies within democracies, looking at law, this kind of tendencies becomes more apparent. But when you discussed about current level of lawlessness being different than classical models of authoritarianism, I was wondering whether precisely this absence presence of law is a ruling technology for current authoritarianism or not, because on one level there is a widening scope of legal punitive infrastructure of the state, and there is the impunity for the power holders, etc. But precisely in this absence presence, the system seems to be generating consent for further involvement of law, for punishing the other power holders, etc. So I was curious about your reflections on the absence of law, and to what extent they are accompanied by an extreme presence of law at this current moment as well, and how this compares to earlier models of authoritarianism.
So 1 minute and a half, and then we will wrap it up.
Okay, well, I think that I put the grand narrative more like a question mark than anything else, because I don't know if it's possible to do this reenchantment or this level of democratic innovation without grand narrative. But I think the alternative will certainly be this one, is having this interconnection of different democratic enclaves and more democratic ties in our social relations that you were certainly mentioning. Now, who bears the responsibility for more decentralized decision-making? That's a great question. I have no idea, to be very frank and very serious. But perhaps that the question of responsibility, perhaps it becomes less important if we break the decision-making into many small decision-making processes. So we don't necessarily, when you think about the way that the budget works, for instance, the budget, it's a gigantic piece of work to approve and discuss a public budget and to approve it with Congress and then, of course, to execute it. And so, but if you had small parts of this budget where you could necessarily vote, like the idea of the participatory budgeting is interesting because it's not about the whole budget, it's about a part of the budget. So we could think of a democratic practice that is breaking down this big decision makings that we have because we're very bureaucratic in the way that we run state affairs. And of course, this doesn't apply to all public policies, but there are many public policies that we could apply, I believe, this kind of thing. So I think the question of responsibility is less, it's not that it's not important, but it will be less important than if you simply start doing referenda about all the big national public policies that you need. So I agree with you. And my argument, yes, I have a more counter-majoritarian definition of democracy, indeed. I also believe in the importance of majority, but I think that the decision of majority needs, for instance, to be taken into account when it comes, for instance, to the investments, the public investments that we want to do. But I think when it comes to rights and when it comes to the defense of protection of life, I think that we always will risk to, quote, Tocqueville, of a tyranny of the majority. And so I think that ultimately the most important thing. But again, to have a counter-majoritarian way, you need a more equal society. So yeah, I think these things, one nourish the other. And to your point about the absence of law, it's a very, very interesting question. And again, the things that are happening in the past months, and well, also in Brazil and other countries as well, but drives me to this, the idea that you could have people that you're a country and you receive people who are living in one country and they're not citizens from your country and they're in a complete state, like in a complete zone of no law at all. And I know Orla is doing her studies and conducting her research about that. It's very puzzling. I don't know what in the past if we had this experience. One thing is having refugees is different from this experience that you have. So someone who is in jail but is not a national of this country, and he was not even living in this country, he was living in another country. So it's a little bit puzzling for me, this zones of non-law, and I think that we'll need to see what happens, because it's the state of exception in its more roughly. So yeah.
So you cannot help yourself, in spite of speaking of democratic enclaves, ending in these bleak scenarios. So the true self shines through, a tragic subject after all. So Jan Werner, do you have some questions for us to keep thinking with?
Just 2 points, which are probably blindingly obvious for anthropologists. So we had in this room this afternoon echoes of what in the United States came to be known as the fascism debate. I agree with what you said about this subject in your talk. I would just remind ourselves that, of course, a lot depends on your initial understanding of fascism. And one theory that I think has fallen a little bit out of favor is Zev Sternhelz, who famously said, well, this was originally a cultural phenomenon. Don't think about doctrines. Mm-hmm. And I know it's not a groundbreaking insight, culture has changed. So we are too fixated on these one-to-one comparisons. And I think our greatest historian of fascism in this country, Robert Paxton, at one point also said, look, under conditions of consumer capitalism, this is going to look different. Don't just conjure up these images of, young men marching in streets in uniforms in the 20s. It might just have very different practices. So I think that's what we're thinking about. The other thing picks up something that you said about sociability. So I think it's fair to say the far right has been extremely good when it comes to sociability. Whatever else you think about Turning Point USA, it was what Rousseau had told us all along. They were enacting what the French revolutionaries were trying to do. Hand out these hats, everybody looks at everybody else, feels part of a collective, commits to a shared political project. And when you think about, how the other side used to do these things, think back to these very large communist parties in Western Europe and Italy and France, big festivals, big moments of togetherness and so on, sort of dissipated and disappeared. So it's a question of why that happened and whether anything can be revived in that sense.
So before we clap and thank, I just want to thank you all for sticking around. This was a fascinating conversation. I know many more want to ask questions. And maybe like Richard, Arzu, maybe we could organize something with the Human Rights Initiative, like a take two of this conversation. I think we open up a conversation that warrants definitely a few more. And Miguel will stay here the whole semester. He is, as you see, the kindest of souls and a great thinker. So please feel free to reach out to Miguel, to talk to you. Jan Werner, what an honor, what a pleasure to have you here. And let's give both Jan Werner and Miguel a big thank you for this wonderful, wonderful session.